Set summer in motion with the most electrifying Honda vehicles yet. Like the CR-V and Accord, with available hybrid powertrains designed to deliver more thrilling performance and more innovative tech. Summer's here. Make every adventure more electrifying with Honda. For a limited time, well-qualified buyers can get a 3.9% APR on a 2023 Honda Accord Hybrid or 2023 CR-V Hybrid.
Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
See dealer for financing details.
I'm David Bishop, author of MetaGility, and this is the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings. Welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host again, Jay Hersko. Joined with me once again, I have a whole panel. We have Mr. Mike Cadell, or Mike Cadell After Dark. We're going to put that disclaimer out there now.
Howdy, y'all.
We have Jonathan Schneider, who's fresh from Savannah, Georgia.
Hey.
And we have Shira Lehman. Shira, longtime listener, first-time caller. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
There we go. Fantastic. So what are we talking about this week, people? So this week, we're going to discuss a blog post that I forgot who came across it, but it got shared across our Discord server. And it generated enough conversation that we figured it was worth a full recorded episode. The post is from Dave Heinemeier Hansen. I hope I got his name right. I think he's one of the co-founders of Basecamp 37 Signals, along with Jason Fried. He had a post put out on May 25th, which I will link in the show notes. And the title, which is kind of heretical, Manage Process Before People. So I know Mike and I are ex-Waterfall PMs. I know Shira dips her toe into the project management space. I know John's done some work as well. So when I first saw this, it jumped out at me, and the four people on this episode, the four people who responded and said, well, that was a kind of an interesting take. So I'm going to start with you, Mike. What did you think of this, of his argument about why process should be the thing you concentrate on over people, which goes antithetical to 99% of all the stuff that we read, listen, hear, talk about?
Yeah. Well, first thought is you have to question the validity of 99% of the stuff that we read and hear and talk about. Just to be fair.
True.
What DHH is getting at in this article, as it occurs to me, is that if you have solid process that values people and treats people with respect, then you don't need people to, quote, be their manager, because in many circumstances, people are put into, quote, manager roles to compensate for the dysfunctional way that organizations are structured and operate.
What did you think, John?
I have so many thoughts, so I'm going to try and start off with saying it. I understand the sentiment, similar to Mike. Like, it really depends on how you actually see managers and their roles and your perspective on it, because I can definitely be empathetic to the point of, oh, well, more managers must be bad because that just means more overhead and more complications for people. Like, I think that's kind of what the article's sort of implying, that, you want more workers that are self-organizing and autonomous. Like, sure, all those great buzzwords that we all know about. But when you look at the surface of how they're portraying it, and they're kind of saying how you want to be liked because managers are a bad thing, well, then that makes my head tilt on, well, what are they doing? Because, if they're just managing people and doing operations, then I agree with the article. But then I'd say, then you need to reboot and fix your managers more than just do process-driven approach. But once again, situational, right? I can't just make grand statements and assume it's the same thing. But yeah, that was my first initial reaction.
Shira.
I was just thinking about it from the perspective of like, okay, what would this look like at my job, at what my team's doing? And the processes, that's the number one struggle. I'm a BSA, but they put me as a Scrum lead for this team because they just don't have enough Scrum leads. So I'm doing both. And that's the one thing we struggle with, is getting them to do the processes and the things that they're supposed to be doing. And in a perfect world, if they had already been doing all of this, yeah, it would be great. But I think putting that into practice is easier said than done.
I think you're touching on an interesting point where context is the most important part of this article, right? You need to view it through the context of Basecamp and 37 Signals, and 37 Signals has admitted that they have somewhere around 100 employees, right? Somewhere around 100.
Yeah.
So with 100 employees, and I'm not saying that the process before people argument is wrong. We're going to get to that when it comes to enterprise and where that comes in. But I do think there is a nuance to be had where a smaller company that's well in the Dunbar range, like not even close to, the maximum in the Dunbar sequence, it's probably easier to get by with less managers because you have more of those human connections. What was his analogy, Mike? The Dunbar sequence, it's your close friends is 5, 15 is a night out at the bar, 50 was a barbecue, and then 150 was a funeral or a wedding, right? That was his article. So if you think about this number, somewhere between a barbecue and a wedding, right? I mean, there's enough people that you have at least a somewhat one-on-one connection that I think you can get by without as many managers. But they did. I mean, he does have some interesting. So DHH actually talks us through the principles and how they work at 37 Signals, and some of the principles I actually thought were kind of fascinating. The first one that jumped out at me, or the first one he lists, was they replaced the DSU with automated questions.
Jay, wait a minute. Wait, did you just use a 3-letter acronym for the daily scrum?
No. It's DHH is his name. I didn't say DSU.
Yeah. I thought you did. Never mind.
Did I?
Yeah, I heard that too. Sorry.
Oh man.
Man, Jay, I'm heartbroken. You went down the rabbit hole.
All right, who invited Mike After Dark? Okay, so he does. They replaced a stand-up with a set of automated questions. And what are you going to work on? What did you work on today? I mean, Jonathan, thoughts? I don't necessarily think that's the worst thing in the world, especially if there's enough transparency around the work being done.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't really need to, okay, everybody get up, log into the Zoom, what do you think?
Yeah, and this one's once again, context matters, so I'll just answer off both sides of my mouth. Like if you are having if you're in an organization, and by the way, it's not always bad to hear this. For example, my significant other works in an area where there's turnover, where she has new employees coming in monthly. Now, she deals with hourly workers. It's a distribution center. So their onboarding and stuff they do is ridiculously high. So when you have things like, hey, we have people coming in and out, or contractors or people, buttoning up these questions and making it muscle memory and drilling it in. And like, I could absolutely see value in that. Because it drives the mindset and behavior. But I'm personally in my own role, though, I have people that I've worked with for 3 years or more. And if I started to drill these and keep doing it, they'd honestly go nuts, and they want to be more creative and use the time as they see effective. And some of these questions naturally come out not in a dogmatic way at the same time, at the same place every time. So like they would actually make it their own. So I see both sides where, foundationally and mature wise, I get it early on, but after that, you'd actually frustrate a team and hold them back more.
Mike, agree, disagree?
Little different perspective. Think back to the origin of this practice of a daily stand-up. What's the reason? Why do it? What's the benefit? What are we trying to get done?
I kind of understand that, like, having automated questions and just putting them in, because right now the team I have, their daily scrum is not exactly like that, but very close to it, because all the developers are in India, but the lead engineer is in California. So they have their daily scrum there, they record it, and then as people wake up across the globe in other locations, they'll watch it and then know what everybody else is working on. And the people who aren't on that call will put it into the chat in the same meetings call. So we kind of do a combination of that, and I could see the validity in having just that, but I think the combination of it is also good.
Yeah.
Mike, I think your question's spot on though. Like, are you doing it because you were told to do it, or do you know why you do it?
Yeah. So having been taught Scrum way back, the purpose, current day Scrum guide will reinforce this. In a Scrum context, the purpose of a daily Scrum is for the team to align their efforts and coordinate how they're going to work together that day to make progress towards their goal. Right? Much different than answering 3 rote questions. So where I land on it is, what does that team need and what is in best service of that team? The 3 questions or 2 questions or however many you want, doing them asynchronously, like kind of the approach that Shira mentioned, is brilliant. Because it doesn't create a barrier around times and time zones, and if people can consume things and you can gain a shared context asynchronously, which is a very valid thing. What you forfeit in that is the timeliness and the power of that group swarming together, if you will, for a day to figure out how to help each other. And you also you lose out on some of the sense of cohesion and camaraderie that comes with it. You can achieve those things other ways. Those things may not be important for you. As you said at the outset, context matters greatly. So I've coached and worked with teams that say, no, we don't need a daily scrum. And again, using Shira's example, they're spread all over time zones. I've worked with alleged teams that are in
alleged teams. I like
India. There people in India, in Eastern Europe, in England, in East Coast US, Mountain Time and Pacific Time, and coordinating that, and then occasionally we'd have some folks from the Philippines. So putting all that together and trying to force fit that into the mold of, we need to get together to answer these 3 daily questions, was just stupid. And we didn't do it. We did asynchronous coordination, and we accepted the limitation that our collaboration was not going to be as rich because we didn't, and that's not a function of the 3 questions or this or that. It's a function of how the team was distributed across the globe. So no judgment on it. It's just, different circumstances require different solutions.
We have recurring meetings for the entire team in addition to their daily scrum that they do. And we have twice a week where everybody joins, and we have it at a time where everybody across the globe can join. Yep. And we record them, and that's where they do their deep dives, their collaborations, and all of that stuff. But we know ahead of time what we're going to talk about in these meetings because we all watch their daily scrum recording, and we all keep up to date on those in the same chat where the recording is saved.
Yeah. And what DHH mentions in this article is it allows people within the team and outside the team to be aware or in the loop, as they say, on what someone's working on. So this is a good illustration of how you can create shared context asynchronously, and that's what this is doing. And you know what? It's different than synchronous context. Who's to say what's good or bad?
It does make me think of I just finished, and Mike and I were talking about this, the book Rational Ritual. And I think we're probably going to do an episode, a deep dive on it. I learned more about the importance of ceremonies, right? Mm-hmm. After reading that book, and then why they're so important and how to solve these coordination problems. I really, we'll dive into that. But the idea of the DSU was meant to create some common knowledge, which solves your coordination problem. If you can create that and not be in a room, okay, well, if you don't need a meeting, if you can free up times on people's calendars and create the I know that you know, and you know that I know that you know, okay, great. Yeah. Next one, John, I'm going to go to you. I want to get your thoughts on this because you're very close to the product world. He talks about how they do, and I do have the Shape Up book back here somewhere. They do 6-week cycles, 2-week cooldowns. What were your thoughts on that? And especially, what are your thoughts on that compared to some of the PI planning stuff?
Yeah. And once again, this is one of those things where it's good for you. Like, it makes sense for your business. And that's kind of the way that I usually like to approach all these things with, what's the right cycle? How often should we release? How does it work for the business continuity and planning? I've been in areas, and I'm sure other people in the audience have too, where the customers actually want a software or a product that almost never changes. And if it does, it's because of like security or something really egregious. But financial systems or financial software is a good example, where like if you push an update to a software, to a finance accounting software system, they never want that thing to change. They're like, dude, please leave it alone for 20 years. If it works, do not touch it. And then you have the polar opposite extreme, obviously, that everyone's aware of, where, you know, these fintech companies and FANG companies are pushing, you know, every 13 seconds and like just changing production like crazy. And there's releases like nuts. And so my point is like, yeah, if you want high, good quality context and it makes sense with your business value propositions to do a 6-week cycle and do 2 weeks, and it's a good, healthy balance. And remember the context of the article, right? And 37 signals, like that size of that company for what they do and for the value they produce to customers, like that makes sense. It's a good flow. So that's kind of my approach to that. But to add a little more spice to this, it's actually interesting too. Like they kind of show how they do these 6-week cycles that make sense. I would dig more. I didn't dig into it, but I would be curious to dig into those 6 weeks to be like, okay, what is actually going on, like in terms of research, UX design, the solution, the architecture, because sometimes that's a misleading statement where there's actually architecture and work and things happening before the 6 weeks.
Right.
And so they gaslight you a little bit. So it's not really 6 weeks. So just keep that into context.
The nuance. It's the nuance of the actual process and operating the system. I do, however, the idea of their 2-week cooldowns and the idea of, okay, we've just now sprinted, ran.
Yeah, I actually like that.
Take a beat, take a moment, do some planning, do some thinking. What's the term I came across? I need to have a think. Apparently that's corporate speak. If somebody ever said that to me, what are you, a Vulcan? But I think that also, you know, it reiterates the point that you can't go pedal to the metal 24, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. You just can't. You can't. You're going to kill your people. You're going to kill your org. You need to come off a bit to gains. You need to take you can't sprint the whole race, right?
No, you're right. And the last thing I'll say to that too, and I'm glad you mentioned the 2-week cooldown. The fact that they actually dedicate the 2 weeks as a time, like a whole, is important, because I see a lot of people that are like, oh, we'll put 10% of your capacity to innovation. And I'm like, yeah,
never happens. I've tried. It never happens. Mike, have you ever seen it happen? Have you ever seen it happen where someone says, oh, we're going to carve off, we're going to do capacity Tetris, right? Shout out to Brandy Olson, right? And her book on flow. We're going to do capacity Tetris, Mike. You get 35% of your time on this project, 45% of your time on that project, and then X amount of percent time for improvement and innovation. Does that really work?
I've seen one case where they actually had the discipline to measure that, and they were doing maybe a quarter of their allocated innovation and continuous improvement time to the planned category of work. It's I would say it's a very rare exception if it does happen. And underneath that is the way that it's presented here, with 6-week cycle, 2-week cool down. If you look at SAFE, the Scaled Agile framework, they have the innovation and planning sprint is a similar concept. Gone are the days of that innovation and planning sprint being the hardening sprint.
Right.
They've moved away from that, fortunately. But what's always problematic when trying to explain the idea of the innovation and planning sprint is the visceral reaction to, what do you mean you're not doing work for 2 whole weeks?
We could do a whole episode on overcoming objections to the IP sprint. Like, we could literally do it. It might be like 6 hours. We'll have people calling in after it started to say, I have feelings, because
just start a radio show.
yeah, right. You're on the air. Agile with Jay, you're on the air. But I do think that's a whole topic in and of itself, overcoming that. And no offense to anyone, it's a mental block. It's a mental stumbling block that you need to unlearn what you think about capacitization to relearn, to say, oh, we need this.
And it's rooted more often than not in fear. But to John's point, and your point, Jay, about that we're going to take our 10% of time for innovation and spread it out over the mid-range time box. Why that doesn't happen is or why that approach is taken, I should say, frequently in my experience, is because it's a way to give lip service to the idea, but not confront the reality that we are taking time to investing time in getting better and getting faster at what we do. So Jay, it all comes back to biology and human nature.
Yep.
By the way, quick funny story to that. There was a company at one point that wanted to push a learn, grow, and go program where they wanted everyone to allocate 10% of their time toward learning. And for 6 months, every single individual, and I'm telling every single individual contributor said, yeah, no, none of that ever happens. We never have time. It's just for show. And so I actually went to leadership and said, do you truly believe in this? And they went, absolutely, we want to do. So I said, great, we're going to make every team that when they sprint plan, the first thing they do is plan learning items in the backlog and claim their time. Immediately there was backpedaling because then they realized how much work was actually getting put in sprints that lowered their capacity. And they actually, it was an awkward conversation.
I think you and Mike are touching on the whole, it's talking the talk and walking the walk. It's proving what's actually going on behind the scenes. Shout out to Training Day. It's the movie I quote the most. It's not what you know, it's what you can prove. I think that those things, they throw a big magnifying glass on what people think is happening. What is it? The way the process is designed, the way the process is described, the way the process actually gets done. Like all three of these things are the way it's documented. They're all completely different. There was another thing that he calls out here this year. I wanted to ask you about this because I think out of all of us, you're the most recent in your role. He talks about how the review of work for new employees and how they specifically assign that to a mentoring peer. So they have someone who's senior staff member serves as a mentor for a single person. And then the mentors are given responsibility to say, if she was my mentor, you are the one responsible for making sure my work quality is of what you're expecting, right? Does this make sense? And do you think this is actually possible in a company of a larger size, that whole idea?
So I love that idea. And my now boss, not the one who I started with, the first thing she did was set me up with two mentors. We met every week. Now it's every 2 weeks. And that was the most helpful thing ever because I got to know them and then I feel comfortable asking questions. And it just really helped me get more comfortable in my role and learn the correct processes and procedures and stuff. And is that feasible in a bigger company? I think it depends on who the management is. Because like I said, my new boss, that's the first thing she did. My previous boss was like, sit there and read all these Confluence pages and I'll get to you eventually, So like it really depends on if the person who is in charge is invested in the employees that way,
Great way to put it. I'm sure John's hired people. I think Mike has hired people. We've all had the instance of where we had to hire people and we're paying them to sit around because the hardware isn't ready, the network access isn't ready, they don't have rights to this. They're still trying to figure out that. Now, I do think the other extreme is the extreme of, hey, you start a job at Etsy at 9 a.m. and by 10:30 you're pushing code into production. I think that's maybe a little bit delusion to grandeur, right? I think for them it works, but I also think that I have seen some catastrophically bad software engineers.
I mean, that's another problem. Like I'm on a team right now that R4 is their last release and the team's getting disbanded. So they don't even have any motivation to put any good practices and processes into place. So it's an uphill battle for me as a Scrum lead. It's like I got them to record and like collaborate on their daily stand-up, but the engineer in California wasn't even aware they were doing a stand-up every day. Like I had to say, okay, we need to do a daily stand-up. And then they said, oh, we already do that. And some people on the team were like, oh, we do? So it's like a lot of people not communicating and not being aware of what the processes are. But like I said, it depends on who is running the team. And if they have a timestamp on the team, like the people aren't going to be very motivated to do any of this stuff. It's like, why do we have to now like start story pointing with the entire team when we used to do it with just the developers working on the story, and like, why are we bothering to do this when this project is ending in 3 months,
Mike.
Yeah, and so kind of reinforcing and piggybacking, easy for me to say, off what Cher was just saying. Can the process about of having mentoring peers review the work of new employees, I can that work in larger organizations? I'll use the quote at scale, which I've come to hate the term because it's overloaded. But can it work in large corporations with lots of people? And I'll offer a slightly maybe controversial answer is that is the only way to effectively bring new people into the work and the work culture of an organization, regardless of the size. So there's a benefit of having someone who's roughly a peer being the person who's helping and onboarding a new person, because it takes away much of the power dynamic. So if I'm looking to the person who's my quote boss, I'm going to be much less likely to ask questions as I'm learning things, because I'm afraid I'm going to look like a schmuck who doesn't know what he's doing. I do that in many other ways, so no need.
I don't help besmirching my own name.
Yeah, but the idea of peers mentoring really is effective. The firm that I work in, we do that. We hire every year. We hire a couple new college grads, and what we've recently started doing is having the new college grads work on an engagement with a senior person. And that senior person is responsible for mentoring that new college grad and helping that person understand what we do and why we do it. And the potential for the peer-to-peer learning is fantastic. And the added benefit is it keeps the senior people a little more on their toes, having to explain to someone why we do something. Kind of keeps you on your toes, and maybe you go, yeah, this is the way we do it, and we're considering doing something different, which is a code for saying we do this now and this is stupid. I just realized, so I'm gonna try to change it.
So I'm gonna take us a little bit off to the side. I'm gonna ask you this, Jonathan. I'm gonna put you on the spot. We've talked about management, right? Specifically, which is the oversight of people who work in your company. Typically, a lot of companies have people who are managers, but are also responsible for delivery of something, right? So they are simultaneously an individual contributor and a manager. Good idea, yes or no?
Yeah, the concept of working managers is always a spicy thing that a lot of leaders love to have, because once you get a taste of it, it's like a thing of dopamine where they're like, oh, wow, look how much more efficient. And they're probably someone who did this in the past who got promoted because they were so good at it. And it's funny you say managers. Heck, I know a lot of people that are working directors and working executives even that fall into this trap. And I say trap because on average and normally these people that continue to do this in the lack of their good people leadership and strategy succeed by showing their individual contributions. And it's unfortunate because if other leaders or peers see this happening, what they should call out is that's a really good individual contributor that needs their career or organizational design fixed, because that person is probably not in the right spot to be best optimized. That's the way it should be viewed. There's no harm or shame, and because this actually is another thing. A lot of people in the food and restaurant industry will say nothing's better than a manager who knows if they're short-staffed, they can roll their sleeves up and help the employees, and the employees love it.
Right.
So there's a little bit of that too there, where if if you're on a late software development deployment and it's going wrong and the manager hops on and just helps facilitate, like teams love that managers care and do some of that stuff. So I have to be careful to say it's not always bad, but when they're doing it as their primary thing, yeah, I would course correct it.
In my own experience, I've done both. I've been just a manager. I've also been a manager who's also an IC. I've been just an IC, and I am, unless I am an aberration, I strongly think that you can't have a manager who you're also tasking with delivery, right? I go back to, I forget what book it was. They talk about there's two kinds of people in an organization. There's the people that manage the delivery of value, right? So this is your developers, your software engineers, your testers. But there's the people who manage delivery value. And there's the people who manage the people who deliver value. I think I'm of the personal opinion, when you start crossing the streams, you're doing two jobs equally badly. And then when you have multiple directs, the number of directs increases. And then, I mean, what is your raison d'etre, right, to being there? Am I there to make John Shearer and Mike better, to support them and get them to grow? Or am I there to deliver the widget? Because if I have to do both, somebody's getting short shrifted at a certain point. Again, now we're back to not capacity Tetris, but area of focus Tetris. Mike.
So the point of view you just articulated, Jay, makes a lot of sense in the context of what we know as management roles and duties in a typical corporate structure. What DHH advocates here, whether that is scalable to tens of thousands of people, is a follow-on discussion. But what he's advocating here is that the role of manager is so much lighter weight that you can effectively do creating work, direct value creating work, and be the manager, because it doesn't take a whole lot of time, focus, energy, and effort in the way that his companies are set up. So that there's a bit of a finer point underneath that, and I'm not naive enough to say that, yeah, this could work at global bank, global insurance company with 48,000 people. Don't know. Gonna guess maybe not, but could something more like this and less like what most organizations work with today be effective? Hypothesis, yes. Would love to have a chance to prove that out.
Very true. I mean, there's the scale thing that comes into play. The other aspect of management that we're not talking about is Jonathan is an amazing web UI developer. He is so amazing that we're gonna promote him into management.
Yeah. So
because John's a great employee. Yeah. And then we wonder why John looks like, he goes from having a full head of hair to Mike's head of hair in like 6 months, and we can't figure out why. I mean, we also need to be more, and I think most companies are getting smarter with this, where you do need to have that principal track of someone who is very good at the particular skill that they're in, giving someone a promotion into management because that's your way of recognizing their hard work, and taking one of my 4 comp science major interns, right, who's been here 4 years and is really good, and then making them a manager of people when they may not have even taken any management courses.
I was just gonna say, like, they give us like a stipend for like classes and stuff related to our work, and my boss's boss mentioned that there were some leadership classes at Wharton that he recommended we go for, like the entry level and lower level employees, and I think this is what he's anticipating. So like when we get to that point where, you went from doing dev work to you could be a manager now, at least you have some kind of tools and skills for that, which is,
I mean, that's the example of scaling people up to get them to be ready. So when that opportunity does present itself, if that's your path, that they're there. But I've seen many developers become managers and just
So quick hot take. I think it's worse to have a person who shifts to a manager role that's not ideal or good, but is going to figure it out. What's worse than that is actually HR trained person who speaks like a robot and comes off very ungenuine with their employee. I've actually been more irritated and frustrated by a manager who's just reading books like a robot and going through the motions than someone who actually sits down with me and goes, I really don't know what I'm doing, so I'm just going to talk with you and figure it out. Like, I actually like that approach more than someone that's just doing motions.
Very true.
Because that's an authentic.
Yes,
exactly.
Right. That takes all the stress right out of the room because you're like, hey, John's figuring it out. I'm figuring it out. Shira's figuring it out. All three of us are figuring it out together. So we really can't get mad at each other because we all know that we're all just trying to figure it out, which is that's a whole different conversation. The whole bring your whole stuff to work versus the emotional safety versus just authenticity. Right. One of the things I forgot to touch on it when I was asking Shira about the whole making an employee as a mentor and having them judge their work. There was an article, I think I threw it in Discord, about the Feynman learning technique from Richard Feynman, where he talks about how the best way to know if you learn something is read a lot about it and then try and explain it to someone else. And if you can't, you obviously don't know enough. And if you can explain it to someone else, then he says, well, simplify your language, add metaphors, add analogies, make it easier to speak. If I ask Shira, who's my colleague, hey, how do I do this? And she goes, I don't know, this process is completely stupid. I learned a whole lot more by that one off the cuff remark than hours to go back to Shira, hours of reading a Confluence page. So I think we're making good on time. So I want to go around the table. The article really was about process and how process with a well-defined a feedback loop heavy process, you can get away from having traditional managers and you don't have to worry about managing the people so much. But we also touched on all sorts of things around management and just best practices. John, final thoughts?
So to ask the question, should we manage process before people? I think it goes back to, if I had to put a very default generic answer, it's hard to structure and lead with process when people need context and reasoning behind the process of why it's there. So I can definitely understand and be empathetic and even see value in driving process and having it be established, or as I would just call it, good behaviors and mindset, really more than process. But the people have to have context as to why. And that's why I still hesitate and say, we really got to focus on the people to make sure the change management and adoption's there before you just jump in and just throw stuff at them to be dogmatic.
Agreed. Shira.
I was just gonna say, I think putting processes before people is really nice and whatever, but you have to, like Jonathan said, the context. And also the managers that you do have, you have to make sure they're really invested in your employees and want to manage them in a way where they could be self-sufficient like this.
Well said. Mike.
We're fighting biology, Jay. It's a bit of a false dichotomy to try to equate one better than the other, one first, whatever. Look back at the Agile Manifesto, that this over that doesn't mean you exclude the thing on the right. It's just not your focus. In the title of the article, manage process before people, the way that occurs to me is have sound process in place so that you can then spend your time on people, to John and Shira's points.
Mm-hmm.
And you get the happy circumstance of people know what to expect. They kind of know how to do their job, and you don't got to spend as much time fixing problems that come up with the human OS.
Right.
So it's a both, and done in the appropriate balance.
You just reminded me of Johanna Rothman's quote where she just said, "We employ adults. We employ adults. We should treat them like adults."
So, yeah.
Right? Okay, so I want to thank everybody. This has been a great, quick conversation, unstructured and unscripted, but I thought we did the topic justice. I will link to the article in the show notes. Once again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening. Patreon, Discord, blah, 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 blah. Until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.